The night my son-in-law leaned across the kitchen table and told my daughter she was embarrassing him in front of his colleagues, his mother patted his arm and said, "She'll learn." My daughter looked at her plate. I looked at my hands, and I made a decision I did not speak aloud. "My name is Harriet." "No, that's taken." "My name is Mona. I am 64 years old, and I live in Oakville, Ontario, in a neighborhood where the driveways are shoveled before 7 in the morning, and nobody talks about what happens behind the front doors with the matching wreaths. I spent 31 years as a social worker with the region of Halton. I have sat across from people in the worst moments of their lives. I have filled out forms that determined whether children went home or didn't. I learned very early that what a family looks like from the outside tells you almost nothing about what is happening on the inside. I never thought I would need that knowledge for my own daughter. My daughter, I'll call her by what she was before all of this, herself. Her name is Petra. She is 36 now. When she was small, she used to reorganize the kitchen cupboards because she said the way I stacked the mugs made no sense. She was 8. She was right. By the time she was in her 20s, she was a contracts administrator for a construction firm in Mississauga, the kind of woman who reads an agreement in full before signing anything, who sends emails at 11 at night, not because she was told to, but because she cared about getting it right. Her father, rest his soul, used to say she had a mind like a level, always finding what was off, always correcting it. He died 4 years before any of this started. A cardiac event, very sudden, very quiet, the kind of death that doesn't announce itself and leaves everyone standing in the kitchen holding a casserole they didn't ask for, not knowing what to do with their hands. Petra grieved hard. She didn't show it in ways people recognize easily. No crying in public, no falling apart at the office. She showed it by becoming very still, very accommodating, very careful not to need too much from anyone. That was when my son-in-law found her. His name is Curtis. He came into her life at a professional networking event in Berlin. One of those Thursday evening things at a hotel conference room where everyone holds a drink they don't want and talks about Q4. He was in commercial real estate. He was charming in the particular way of men who have practiced it. He asked questions. He listened, or seemed to. He told Petra that most people in their industry didn't think the way she did, and the way he said it made her feel seen rather than singled out. I met him 4 months in. He shook my hand with both of his, looked me directly in the eye, called me Mrs. Bellerose without being asked, and brought a bottle of Niagara-on-the-Lake Riesling, because Petra had mentioned I liked white wine. I thought he was considerate. I thought my daughter had found someone solid. I was reading the surface. I should have known better. They married 18 months after they met. Small ceremony, late October, at a vineyard in Prince Edward County. His mother, her name is Suzanne, gave a toast that was mostly about Curtis. What he had built, what he had overcome, what he deserved. She said he had chosen well. Not that Petra was wonderful, or that they were lucky to have her in the family, that he had chosen well. Like Petra, it was a property he'd assessed and acquired. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself this was her style, not her meaning. That was my first mistake. The changes in Petra were not sudden. They never are. If someone had shown me a photograph of my daughter at our Christmas dinner the year before the wedding and another photograph of her 14 months after, I would have said the second woman looked tired, careful, like someone who has learned to take up less space in a room. But because I was watching it happen in real time, in small increments, I kept explaining it away. She stopped calling me on her drive home from work. Those calls had been ours for years. 20 minutes of traffic complaints and work gossip and plans for the weekend. When I asked why they'd stopped, she said Curtis liked quiet evenings. He worked long hours. He needed to decompress. She said it the way you'd say the dishwasher runs on the sanitize cycle, like it was just a feature of the household she had adapted to. She stopped wearing the earrings her father gave her, not all at once. First, they disappeared from her work photos, then from holiday dinners. When I asked, she said Curtis found them a bit much for his clients' events. She said it with a small shrug that broke my heart a little, though I couldn't have said why at the time. She stopped disagreeing with me. My Petra, who had been arguing with me about everything from how I loaded the dishwasher to federal housing policy since she was 13, suddenly agreed with everything I said. Yes, Mum, you're probably right. I hadn't realized how much I loved her pushback until it was gone. Suzanne visited often. Too often, I thought, though Petra never said it that way. Suzanne had opinions about Petra's cooking, her housekeeping, the way she kept the guest room, the fact that she worked through lunch. She delivered these opinions with a particular kind of warmth that is worse than coldness because it makes you feel ungrateful for noticing. She would lean across the counter while Petra cooked and say things like, "Curtis has always needed a calm home. His first instinct is to provide, you just have to make it easy for him." Or, "A woman who knows how to support her husband is worth more than one who insists on being equal." She said these things like they were wisdom passed down, like she was doing Petra a favor, and slowly Petra began to say them back. The first time I heard Suzanne's phrasing in my daughter's mouth, we were talking about a promotion Petra had been offered, team lead, a role she had been working toward for 2 years. She turned it down. When I asked why, she said Curtis felt it would put too much pressure on the household. She said, "He needs me to be available, Mum. That's how we work." The words were right, but the voice was wrong, flat, recited. I asked her, very quietly, if she was happy. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Not long, but I have spent 30 years learning to read pauses. And then she smiled and said she was just tired. Tired does not make a person edit themselves out of their own life. The dinner happened on a Sunday in March, the 2nd year of their marriage. It was meant to be a simple family meal at their house in Hamilton. Petra had just finished repainting the dining room, and she wanted to show it off. She'd been excited about it in a way I hadn't heard from her in months, that particular energy she gets when she's done something with her hands that she's proud of. When I arrived, the table was set carefully, too carefully, the kind of careful that takes all the spontaneity out of a room. Petra met me at the door and hugged me the way you hug someone when you're relieved they're there. But you don't want to show it. She was wearing a long-sleeved blouse in January colors, despite the fact that we'd had warm weather all week. Curtis was in the living room with 2 of his colleagues from work, men I'd met once before at a firm event. Suzanne was already seated at the table, wine in hand, watching the room the way she always did, like an auditor. Dinner went the way those dinners go. Safe conversation, property values, the Leafs, the new development going up on the escarpment. Curtis held court with an ease that I had once found charming and now found exhausting. Petra brought out the food in courses, moving between kitchen and table, and each time she returned, She checked his face before she set anything down. I noticed. I filed it. It happened when she reached across to refill the water glasses. Her sleeve rode up slightly. Not enough for anyone else to see. Enough for me. A bruise on the inside of her forearm, faded but shaped like a grip. I did not react. I have spent too many years in rooms where reacting wrongly destroyed everything. I continued my conversation. I passed the bread. I listened to Curtis explain to his colleagues why certain neighborhoods in the lower city were undervalued. At some point, Petra set a dish down, slightly off-center. A small thing, a nothing. Curtis looked at it, then looked at her. The conversation didn't stop, but he reached over, without any change in his expression, and squeezed her hand where it rested on the table. Not a tender squeeze. The kind that makes a knuckle whiten. "Be careful," he said quietly, lightly, like a reminder. Suzanne looked up from her wine and smiled. "He just wants things to be right," she said to no one in particular. "He's always been that way. Attention to detail." The colleagues nodded. My daughter said, "Of course, sorry." And the conversation moved on as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't just watched a woman apologize for placing a dish 6 inches to the left of where her husband wanted it. I did not stand up. I did not say anything. I drove home that night with my hands at 10 and 2, and my mind going over every detail the way I had learned to in my first years on the job, before I understood that documentation is the only thing that survives a family's ability to rewrite its own story. I thought about the bruise, the shape of it, the location, the sleeve that covered it, and I began, quietly, to prepare. I want to tell you something about the way these situations work, because if you have never lived close to one, you might be wondering why a woman with 30 years of social work experience didn't simply report what she'd seen or confront her son-in-law directly. I want you to understand that I know exactly why I didn't, and it had nothing to do with fear of him. If I had walked back into that house and accused Curtis of hurting my daughter, Petra would have denied it. She would have defended him. She might have cut contact with me entirely, because that is what people do when they have been slowly taught that their own perception is the problem. The isolation doesn't just remove the people who might help. It makes the victim enforce the isolation herself, because by then she has been trained to believe that outside interference is the real threat. I had seen it in families for decades. It was different when it was mine. That is what I wasn't prepared for. What I did instead was call a colleague, a woman I'd trained with in the 90s who now worked with a domestic violence support organization in the Greater Toronto area. I told her what I had seen. She asked me the right questions. She helped me understand what I was looking at, and she told me the most important thing. The goal was not to rescue Petra. It was to make sure Petra had the information, the support, and the safety she needed to rescue herself. That is a harder thing to hold on to than it sounds. Over the following weeks, I found ways to be present without pressure. I invited Petra for coffee near her office on days when Curtis was out of town. I never asked leading questions. I listened. I noticed what she didn't say as much as what she did. When she mentioned in passing that they'd had an argument about her visiting a friend, I noted it. When she let slip that Curtis had asked her to give him access to her personal bank account. A joint account for household expenses was one thing. He had wanted her personal account, her individual checking. I noted that too. In Ontario, financial control is recognized as a form of intimate partner violence under the Domestic Violence Action Plan. Curtis framing it as practical, as efficient, as just easier for the household. That framing was the point, making her feel like resistance was the unreasonable position. I started a file, not official, a notebook, handwritten, dates and observations. Old habit. It would matter later. Then, about 6 weeks after that dinner, Petra showed up at my door on a Tuesday morning when she should have been at work. She had a bruise along her jaw she had tried to cover with foundation. She was shaking in a way that was not dramatic, just fine and constant, like a window in a cold frame. She didn't say anything for a moment. She stood in my doorway with her coat still on, and then she said, "I think I need help." I have waited a long time to hear those words from someone I love. I didn't know it would feel like being punched. I brought her inside. I made tea. I sat down across from her and held both her hands and waited. She talked for 2 hours. She told me about the argument that had left the bruise. It had started because she'd accepted a lunch invitation from a former colleague without checking with Curtis first. She told me about the grip on her arm in the car the previous winter, the one that had left the bruise I'd seen at dinner. She told me about the time he had taken her keys so she couldn't drive herself to her sister's birthday. She told me about the way Suzanne appeared at the house the day after any conflict, not to check on Petra, but to check on Curtis, to make sure he was all right, to make sure the household was running properly. She told me she had tried, twice, to bring it up with Suzanne, believing that somewhere under all of it there was a woman who might understand. Both times, Suzanne had turned it around. "He has so much pressure. You need to understand how he processes things. Some men need a firm hand to feel secure. And if you can't provide that, you need to ask yourself what you're contributing to this marriage." That was when I understood that Suzanne was not a passive participant. She had built this. She had raised a son to operate this way because it was how she understood a household to function. She had found in Petra a woman she could shape, and when Petra proved more resistant than expected, she had helped her son apply pressure. I did not say this to Petra that Tuesday morning. I just listened. Before she left, I told her 3 things. First, that what was happening to her was not her fault and was not normal. Second, that she had options, including legal ones, and I would help her understand them if she wanted. Third, that whatever she decided to do next was her decision. I would not push her, I would not judge her, I would be there. She cried. She said she didn't know how to start over at 36. I said starting over at 36 was a gift she didn't know, yet she was going to give herself. She went home that afternoon. My stomach was in a knot the entire drive, watching her taillights disappear down my street. What happened next was not clean. I want to be honest about that, because the stories we tell about leaving tend to compress time and motive in ways that make it seem more decisive than it is. Petra did not leave immediately. She went back. She called me 3 days later and said, "Things were better. Curtis had apologized. They were going to try couples counseling." I said that was her choice and I supported her. I kept the notebook. Couples counseling with an abusive partner is not the same thing as couples counseling. The research on this is consistent, and it has been part of the training in my field for 20 years. A skilled abuser uses the counseling session to gather information and to appear cooperative, and then uses the information to tighten the grip afterward. When Petra mentioned in their 3rd session that she felt afraid sometimes, Curtis brought it up at home that night. Not to address it, but to punish her for saying it. He told her she had humiliated him, He told her that airing private feelings to a stranger was a form of betrayal. She called me that night at 11:45. She said, "Mum, I think I need to actually leave." I said, "Tell me where you are. I'm coming." That was the beginning of the part that is hard to describe because it moved very quickly and very slowly at the same time. I arrived at the house in Hamilton at midnight. Curtis was not there. He had gone to stay at a colleague's after the argument, which was its own kind of control, the withdrawal as punishment. We had 3 hours. I helped Petra gather what she needed: identification, passport, SIM card, medication, a hard drive she kept her personal files on, enough clothing for a week, and the folder she had quietly been building herself. Banking records, email printouts, photographs of 2 of the bruises she had taken on her phone. She had been preparing longer than I knew. We drove to my house in Oakville. She slept in the guest room with the window cracked, even though it was April and still cold. In the morning, I called my former colleague and we began the process. Within a week, Petra had spoken with a legal aid lawyer through a community legal clinic. She learned about Ontario's Victim Quick Response Program, which helped with emergency funds for survivors of intimate partner violence. She connected with a counselor through a local shelter's outreach program. She wasn't in shelter, but they offered support regardless. She began to understand that there were systems designed to help her, systems that didn't require her to have done everything right, or to have left sooner, or to have fit any particular profile. Curtis, when he realized she was not coming back, reacted the way men like him react when control is removed. He escalated, and then he calculated. He sent messages that were by turns pleading and threatening. He told mutual friends that Petra was having a mental health crisis. He suggested to her workplace, through what channel I still don't know, that she had been behaving erratically and might need to take a leave. He had Suzanne call my number from a blocked line and leave a voicemail, telling me that I had destroyed a marriage by interfering in things I didn't understand. I saved every message. I logged every call. Suzanne was the one who made the mistake that mattered. She sent a text to Petra. She must have believed Petra was still on her side, or she underestimated how much had changed, in which she said, fairly explicitly, that Petra needed to come back and stop making things difficult, and that she had protected Curtis before, and she would do it again, and that a woman who walks away from a good provider deserves what she gets. Petra forwarded it to the lawyer. There was also a conversation that came to light through Petra's discovery process. A message thread between Curtis and a friend in which he discussed, with some casualness, how to handle a woman who was becoming a liability. How he'd learned from watching his mother manage his father when his father tried to leave years ago. His father had a fall, he wrote. Things worked out. I want to be careful about how I say what I'm about to say. Because I am not a police officer, and I did not handle the investigation. What I will tell you is that this message thread was brought to the attention of the right people, that questions were asked, that certain old records were reviewed. Curtis's father died in 2009 at their family home in the Niagara region. The death had been ruled accidental. I don't know everything that followed from that review. What I know is that Suzanne, who had spent the better part of 2 years presenting herself as the reasonable voice in all of this, stopped returning calls and hired a lawyer. Petra's divorce was finalized 14 months after she came to my door at midnight. She did not get everything she deserved, because that is not how family law works, but she got enough. She got her financial independence. She got a restraining order that held. She got her name back. She got herself back. That is the part that takes longer than the paperwork. I want to be honest about this too, because I think we sometimes tell these stories as if leaving is the ending. It isn't. It is the beginning of a different kind of work. Petra spent the first months after the divorce in what I can only describe as a long exhale. She moved into a rental apartment in a part of Hamilton she liked, near the waterfront. She went back to the office. She took walks. She started responding to the colleague invitations she had been declining for 2 years. She was quiet in a different way than she had been during the marriage. Not the quiet of someone holding themselves in check, but the quiet of someone who was paying attention again. She cried more oddly, once she was safe. Her counselor told her that was normal, that the body waits until it believes the emergency is over before it lets you feel what you've been carrying. She ran into Suzanne once, in a Shoppers Drug Mart in Burlington, about 8 months after the restraining order. Suzanne stared at her from across the aisle. Petra held her gaze for a moment and then turned and went to the checkout. She told me about it afterward. She said she wasn't afraid. She said she felt sorry for her, in the particular way you feel sorry for someone who has made themselves small by making others smaller, and has nothing to show for it. That kind of clarity is not something you arrive at quickly. It is something you build, day by day, once you have stopped spending your energy surviving. It has been 3 years now. Petra was promoted this spring. A director-level role, something she had put on hold for so long that I think even she had stopped believing it was still possible. She called me from the parking lot of her office to tell me, sitting in her car, laughing in a way that I recognized from when she was 8 years old rearranging my kitchen cupboards, and proud of it. That laugh. I had not realized how much I had missed it. I am telling this story because I made a promise to myself that I would, and because I know from my years in this field how many families are sitting with a version of this story that they have not yet found language for. I know how many mothers are watching something in their daughters' eyes and telling themselves they're imagining it. I know how many daughters are exhausted from explaining away marks and silences and disappearances. I want to say something plainly, because I spent a career trying to say it to people who weren't ready to hear it, and I know that sometimes it lands and sometimes it doesn't, but I'm going to say it anyway. Control does not need to leave a bruise to be real. It works quietly, and it works through the people you trust, and by the time it has worked long enough, you may not recognize what you trusted in the first place, but you were in there the whole time. Whatever they convinced you that you'd lost, the part of yourself that knew your own mind, that laughed too loud, that reorganized cupboards because you could see a better way, it was in there the whole time, waiting. And it is not too late. Not at 36, not at 48, not at any number that fear has tried to make feel like an expiration date. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you heard something in it that you've been trying not to name, I hope you'll let yourself name it now. And if you're the mother, or the sister, or the friend standing at the edge of something you can't quite see clearly yet, trust what you're seeing. Keep the notebook. Learn the systems. Be the soft place to land without pushing for a timeline that isn't yours to set. That is all I knew how to do. I think it was enough. What part of this story stayed with you? And wherever you're watching from in this country, or anywhere in this world, I'm glad you're here.